CTRL, and I want to welcome you this afternoon to participate, because I think there is going to be some participation required on a topic that I think is very, very timely. There are three panelists who are going to lead us through that discussion. Hopefully it'll be difficult and uncomfortable, but it will also give you some confidence and some tools to engage in similar kinds of discussions with your colleagues, your students, and others you may come in contact with over the next couple of weeks anyway. Before I begin, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. First is that Noontime Conversations is going to take a month-long hiatus, so to let students and faculty engage in all the work that they have to do before Thanksgiving. But we will return November 28th with Sarah Irvine-Belson, School of Communication, Maria Floro, Economics, and Simon Nicholson from SIS to talk about collaborative research. Not simply how to get the funding, but once you get involved in collaborative research, what are some of the things that you have to look out for so that you make your collaborations as productive as possible. So that's November 28th. You'll see emails of that coming out. In between now and then, there'll also be a couple of shorter noontime tech talks led by Larry Engel from the School of Communication, who will walk us through how to use our iPhones for photography and for videos that you can use in your classroom or for your scholarship to disseminate your scholarship in a productive and an effective way. He will also talk about not only how to take videos, but how to edit them, but also if you're going to use them in classroom assignments, how to create rubrics so that you understand how to grade some of these assignments. And so there'll be a really hands-on workshop. And two of those will be happening this coming through November and into December. So look out for emails for that as well. Before I turn the mic over to the panelists, I want to thank the staff of CTRL who are milling about for all the work that they do to put these events together. With that, I'm going to introduce three panelists. Laura Schwartz from the School of Public Affairs, Roshinko from the School of International Service, and Maya Visvari from Health Promotion and Advocacy Center at American University. So with that, Laura, the table is yours. The mic is yours.
And I'm going to yield actually to Maya to start.
Okay. So should we introduce our roles first?
Sure.
Okay.
So, see how collaborative we are? So I teach in SPA government, and I'm the director of the new project on civil discourse. And I'm fortunate that our colleagues agreed to have a conversation roughly in that space of how do we have tough conversations and how do we suss out roughly how we're dealing with this difficult time and our own identities, our students' roles out in the world, if you follow current events, while doing our jobs on this campus.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Absolutely. Sorry. Okay. Hi, I'm Rose Shinko from the School of International Service. I teach classes on identity, race, gender, and culture, and I'm also the acting associate dean for curriculum and learning.
And I'm Maya Visvari. I'm the Sexual Assault Prevention Coordinator in the newly named Health Promotion and Advocacy Center. We were previously the Wellness Center, and I am one half of Oasis. If you've ever seen any of the stickers in the bathroom, that's our office. So I'll go ahead and get us started. I think what I'm going to talk about and focus on is triggers, which is kind of triggering to even hear that word, right? But so just to kind of back up a little bit and to talk about trauma. So, any form of sexual violence, which includes sexual assault, rape, dating violence, stalking, sexual harassment, that all is traumatic. That's a traumatic event or chronic event if it's dating violence, right? There's also other traumas in our lives, right? Does anyone have any examples of another trauma? Donald Trump? Is that what I heard? Okay.
The current politics.
News cycle.
Refugee status.
Car accident, right? So there's traumas like throughout our lives, and some of them intersect, right? And some of them are historical, right? So like slavery, the Holocaust, those are historical traumas. So the way that trauma works is different than non-trauma, right, in our life, in our bodies. Do I have any psych or biology professors here? Okay, well, good. If you do know more than me, just correct me. But the main thing to know about trauma and the trauma memory is it's stored in this part of your brain called the amygdala. There's some handouts in the middle of your sheet. If you want to follow along, you're more than welcome to. But the amygdala is a tiny little almond-shaped part of your brain. And its main function is really one of its main functions is really decoding threat. So knowing if there's any danger around. And just so you all know, our bodies respond just as powerfully to perceived threat as real threat, right? So a good example of this, right? I was in a pretty bad car accident in college, and I was hit by a drunk driver, and he hit me not because he didn't hug the curve, right? So he didn't hug the curve and hit me head on. Now, that was 11 years ago, and I still, when I go around a curve, I feel a tension in my body, right? So that's a perceived danger has been encoded in my brain. So the other thing about the amygdala is it's very sensory based, right? So this is our primal form of our brain, our reptilian brain. So oftentimes this means that triggers and trauma memories are related to a sense. A very common version of this in our culture is when we talk about veterans and fireworks, right? So they're triggered by the sound, perhaps the smell, if they smell the gunpowder. So lots of things can be triggers. So I mentioned earlier that I'm one half of OASIS, which is the Office of Advocacy Services for Interpersonal and Sexual Violence. The other half is here, Sarah Isagari. So Sarah is actually our primary advocate, and in our advocacy, this means that we work one-on-one with survivors. And so we've heard all different types of triggers in our time with students. Everything from the sight of a blue wall, to the sound of a bus door opening and closing, to the smell of cologne, right? So, can you not hear me? Okay, sorry, I am having a cold right now, so my voice is a little lower than usual. So, triggers kind of can be everywhere in anything, right? So that's a little daunting to think about. And oftentimes a survivor doesn't know what a trigger is going to be. So they'll just kind of be moving through the world and something will trigger them. They're not expecting it. And they oftentimes, a trigger will also bring up a memory that has been suppressed. So what happens when somebody is triggered? Oftentimes it's a moment of panic, an overwhelming moment. So it can be really hard to be in a conversation, be in the classroom, be in civil discourse, right? So just keeping that in mind. But this doesn't mean that we should just shut off the world, right? Because everything can be a trigger. So an example of kind of a challenge that I've had with triggers recently is, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's purple lights and ribbons and yard signs around campus. We're in the middle of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and purple has kind of been the color for DVAM for a long time. And a student told a staff member that they were triggered by the purple, right? So does that mean that, I take down all the purple because somebody was triggered by it? So that's something that we navigate in our office, the line between raising awareness and making sure that that awareness isn't triggering for survivors. We've seen trigger warnings go well and not go well in classroom experiences, as told to us by students. And I actually like to use the word content warning because I think it doesn't come with all this politicalness with it. A good example of a content warning might be, in the syllabus, if there's a reading, content warning, there is a explicit description of a rape on page 72. If this is going to be upsetting for you, please skip it. Not reading this does not mean you're going to not succeed in the class, right? So making sure that this sort of content isn't going to be indicative of their success in the classroom. Some things when trigger or content warnings have gone wrong is a lot of times when there's not one, right? Or a survivor is surprised by a video that they're watching in class, and they have to kind of leave. I think one of the most overwhelming feelings when somebody is triggered or panicked is kind of this need to get out, right? Because that's the amygdala going off that there's danger. It's not always logical, right? But that's just kind of what's happening in the body. So yeah, I think that's where I'm gonna leave it at right now for this discussion, and then we'll come back to some other things. Yeah.
Add something real quick.
Yeah.
And so one of the most recent issues that we've had. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Again, my name is Sarah. So one of the most recent sort of triggering issues that we've seen like an uptick in people accessing services is with the Kavanaugh hearing specifically. And so I think that, because I've heard this from several students, totally well-intentioned professors were like, okay, we're gonna just watch the hearing in class because it's topical, it's timely. But when a student comes in with a trauma history, right, and we know that it's like between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 college women will experience either attempted or completed sexual assault, and they're not given the opportunity to know that that's going to happen, and it's live, so no one really knows what's going to be involved in the hearing. That in particular was sort of something that we saw a lot of students having issues with. And maybe you'll come to this later, but also like a content warning or a trigger warning doesn't mean that students have to avoid these topics specifically, because that can be just as unhealthy for them, because it creates sort of like a phobia around these topics and more heightened anxiety over time. So there are ways to make accommodations and to make it more comfortable for students, and I'm sure Maya will get into that, but that's all. I just wanted to add that.
And just a process note, so that was really helpful. One of the things we're going to do is that each of us is going to introduce a hypo, an actual challenge in our piece, and Maya's writing hers up now. And then we're going to go to put it into your hands to solve the problem with your tables, each of these ideas, and bring it back together. So one of them will be around this very challenge.
Okay, very good. All right, so is this on, or am I, okay. Okay, is that good? It's not on. It is on? Okay, am I close enough now? Okay. All right, hopefully that is better. All right. My background in SIS, I'm a political theorist, I'm an IR theorist, and I always begin from where I'm located, because I think that has a tremendous impact on how I teach and how I design classes. So my comments, the things that I would like to share or would like us to consider, is to consider where we're located and how we see ourselves as we are designing a class and as we are pulling readings together. We're thinking about the themes, the topics we want to cover. And from my theoretical perspective, I come much more on the left from a more post-structural, postmodern point of view. And so from a highly critical view of liberalism, of the liberal version of multiculturalism, the liberal version of pluralism, and the idea is to problematize. And I think this is what gets to the heart of some of these conversations we're having in the classroom, or we should be having. Two things: the role of the liberal arts curriculum, the role of the liberal arts education, and the role of a professor in a liberal arts classroom. And for me, the starting point is always one of self-reflexivity. What are my attachments? What are my no-go lines? What am I protecting? What am I defending? To the best of my ability to become cognizant of the ideas, the themes, the things that I am protecting invariably when I step into a classroom. We all do it. We all have deep attachments. Part of teaching is learning to recognize your own, and via doing that, enabling your students to recognize their own deep attachments. And that opens onto a space, if you struggle with it and your students see you struggling with it and trying to address some of these really deep kind of philosophical issues, you can open up into a space where you recognize the contingency of the things we're grappling with. And you also recognize and create a space of vulnerability, where the professor, in many cases, I mean, right now, even speaking to you, I feel a tremendous sense of vulnerability because I've not figured this out. I experiment, I attempt to try different things in the classroom that work, that don't work. But I'm very cognizant of the fact that a liberal ideology has pretty much a very narrow band of what is acceptable discourse, and has a very narrow band of what is acceptably defined as pluralistic. And the things that fall off on the sides of liberalism in that broader, and I'm speaking about liberalism in its broadest sense, that Enlightenment inheritance, there are spaces where we know we don't want to admit certain perspectives into our classrooms. Liberalism doesn't want to admit certain things. And so much of my critical work is trying to become very cognizant of where we draw those lines. I'm not going to tell you where to draw them. I am really a typical postmodernist. I'm not going to figure this out for you. But my job with my students is to help them illuminate where those lines are that we draw in conversation. What can I talk about? What am I willing to admit into the classroom? What ideas are we willing to grapple with? And I know this is a very philosophical, kind of broad discussion, but that's how I start this. And then I really take a look at the idea of narrative. And when I teach myself and when I engage my students, I realize we all come with stories. We all make sense out of the world by telling stories. We narrate our past, we narrate our present, we narrate our future. And we have got to learn ways to pay attention to those narratives and to encourage those narratives to come out in the classroom. And to do that in a way, I know the topic is how do we do that in a way where the discourse is civil and where students feel that they can share certain narratives and stories. And the ability to narrate and to recognize different narratives for me sits in a philosophical context of teaching students to engage in an ethics of encounter, to learn how to encounter people, to learn how to approach people. And that's very different from defining people and identifying people. To encounter someone, to listen to their narrative, to share your narrative with them, to figure out where they're located. It's not to privilege one narrative over another, but to realize we all pretty much think about it the rest of the day. How many times you engage in narrative, in storytelling, about who you are, what you're doing, why you're doing it. And I think it's important for students to become aware of how and why they can be afflicted by the performance of the other when someone else is narrating their story. That space of empathy, how you listen to someone, what their experiences were. And that's part of this space of vulnerability. So this, for me, is a philosophical kind of framework of how I approach inclusive pedagogy, how I approach creating conversations in the class. It's structured around the readings I give them. It's structured around the visuals I give them. I do things like when we discuss Katrina and we start to illuminate issues of identity, race, gender, and class in the wake of Katrina. I put up a visual, a photograph on the front of the classroom. The photograph is of an African American individual. However, you can't immediately tell the gender of the person, you can't tell the sex of the person, you don't know any of the context of the person other than what you can see on their face. Extreme distress, extreme pain. I asked the students in small groups to think, what are the visual kinds of cues they're picking up that would help them narrate what they think this person's story might be. And so they spend time just looking at the visual, and they talk about, who is this person? What do we think happened to them? They've done a lot of deep reading on Katrina, on what happened, so they've got a context that they could interpret some of the visual cues in the photograph. But there's nothing else. There's nothing, no text. And then everyone will speak and talk about how they might narrate that photograph, what they're seeing and why they're seeing it. And then I will reveal to them after those conversations who that person really was and what actually happened to them. And it's fascinating in the way they made determinations about who they thought was a woman because of the way they read pain on the face, how they identified class, how they identified what the context might be. And that's a way that you can start to create these conversations around a sense of shared vulnerability, the participation in narration, the participation in how we create meaning about what we are seeing and why. And so I try to sprinkle different things like that throughout my class. So the goal is that students will feel more comfortable sharing their own stories and also engaging some of these more difficult topics. I'm going to end with, in terms of self-reflexivity, these were a couple of comments I received on my teaching evaluations. And I'm sharing them with you because they raised problematic issues for me that I struggle with. Okay, now what am I going to do to respond to these comments that students raised? A lot of the comments in the class were man-hating. Too much class time was spent talking about the negatives of men and not about learning. Second student, some seemed critical of the course. I think that some of the white males in the class felt unsure to share their views, or anyone in the class who had a differing opinion because it might offend people. I don't know what the solution to this could be, but it is important. And those really stung. And I thought, and I literally went back and I rethought every single piece of the class, as much as I could, every interaction, to figure out where and when I did those things that would have a student come up with that kind of a reaction, and to think about how to address that. Then one more. I wish that we could have done more about our own place within the matrix of domination and society within systems of inequalities. We learn about how systems are created and reified by us and by powerful people in society, but it becomes really difficult to leave the classroom, to go out and live our lives after learning this daunting and depressing information. I think we should devote a lot more time to acknowledge our places of power and privilege as well as marginalization, so we have a pathway to move forward and some semblance of how to continue our lives, even without any normalcy. Very, very thoughtful, provocative comments by students, and if those are the kind of comments I provoke, at the end of the day, I think I'm doing okay, but I need to do a better job in addressing some of those. So I will be quiet, and my problematization is really, how do you address some of those very honest, open kinds of criticisms of your class that literally cut to the core of it.
Thank you. Quick show of hands. How many of you are also a person, much like your students? Not many? Wow, Bill's not sure. Are you also people? Yeah. Okay. So yes, that was a really easy question. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think Rose really queued up some of the challenge, and Maya, some of the challenges of the student experience in the classroom, whether from I find this space inadequately accessible to me as a place to learn, because there are things that are difficult here that actually tie to my past experiences, right? And that's the idea. So is the classroom inclusive enough? Well, I have this hurdle, you see, to this space, to this content, right? And then with Rose's, I think, very brave statement around the evals, I don't know if I find this class equally inclusive, because what if my opinions aren't equally welcome in here? What if there's a barrier to me saying that which I would like to say, would want to say? And that's really important. And though, most of us maybe have burgeoning certainty and awareness that we are people too, whether we're faculty or we're student-facing staff, or we're all in a university, we're all walking around, even if we're working here, not particularly student-facing, we're walking through this very political campus, this campus that often has lots of controversy, this campus that's had bias incidents targeted at us. So every one of us is walking around as a human being, one hopes, and doing this job as a human being, often with student evaluations of teaching as part of our life here. And that matters too. And there's a component of it that I think Rose really illustrated that's like, okay, I have to look inward at myself and see how whatever it is about me, my experience, my identity, my power, my worldview, my political or philosophical orientation is contributing to the space that I build here as a classroom, right? And though too, I think there's an element of saying, what is it about this classroom, this challenge, this job, that can be tough for me as a human being? How do I navigate the challenges of being a human being in a classroom? We're supposed to be making sure nobody feels like, oh wow, I can't talk, I'm not welcome, this isn't a good space for me. And we assume or try to get into an idea of, well, if I'm as neutral as I can be, then my space will be more inclusive, right? That's really challenging because we're all human beings. And there's an extent to which you can never strip yourself away from offering any of your identity and your experience and your orientation into that space. And there's an extent to which it wouldn't really be fair, right? You follow current events, I assume. There's stuff going on out in the world that hurts, right? And it hurts if you're, a lot older than Maya, I just learned, teaching, and it hurts if you're 18, possibly. Or maybe it feels triumphant to you, but it has a feeling, and it's a deeper, more powerful one, I think, than I can ever recall at a specific time. So what do? Is a requirement of being a student-facing person or any colleague in a workplace today where we have this tension of be neutral so that nobody feels like, hey, I can't share my opinion or what's going on with me in your class or challenge your class. Be neutral in that way, but be a human being. And that's really hard. And I think that's where we get, the idea of the civility concept that we've been introduced to, is there's this tension between sort of an intellectual freedom and rigor and inclusiveness. So people are very put off by the term trigger warnings. They imagine it to mean some people just don't have to do school, which is not what it is. It's saying, hey, this is about to be a pretty, serious thing for a lot of people, though a lot of people are going to have a strong reaction to. Like, are you ready? Okay, that was just a trigger warning, right? David Price is starting tonight. No one knows what's going to happen. That was just a trigger. Okay, no Red Sox fans, fine. Right? That was a trigger warning for you. That's all. You know, I can't guarantee you this is going to be anything but a nightmare. That was a trigger warning. Everybody's fine, right? But what do you do if you're? It is my belief that you have to create an inclusive community, but not at the cost of your humanity, right? So I don't think the tension is actually between some kind of civility that has to be coded in a complete lack of values. No, there's no difference between disliking Nazis and disliking Jews. Are we all happy? Are we inclusive now? Like, that cannot be the cost, right, of teaching. And it can't be a requirement of this job that we just let the students know we have no values at all and have come to none. So I think the tension is actually not between civility and neutrality and honesty, or diversity and civil discourse. I think the real tension is between between sort of acknowledging, looking inward, and looking outward at your community, balancing what you need for yourself and what you are going to require from yourself. Those are the first questions that I think each of us needs to be asking in deciding what kind of learning community to create. What do I want from myself, and why? What is it I'm trying to do here? If I'm trying to make a space where everyone feels comfortable, does that mean making a space where everyone feels comfortable whether their opinion is the Holocaust never happened, 15 is smaller than 5? Or is it a space where everyone feels comfortable doing what we came here to do, right? So if our university chaplain were here, he'd say, oh, start with the question, why am I here? But actually, that's a good question, right? That's called learning objectives. Why am I here, right? A lot of what we don't want to see, attacks on people's humanity, are stuff that have actually nothing to do with why we're here, you know? We're not here to own the libs. I guess if your class is about effective use of social media to rile people up, maybe learning to own the libs. We're not here to shame someone for how she voted. I don't know of a learning objective that includes that. But we're also not here to watch people hurt others, right? So an example for me of a real challenge in trying to be, and I actually do quite well in the how welcome do conservatives feel in your classroom. I'm pretty liberal. Less so than a lot of my students, but, you know, pantsuit, right? But pretty liberal, but I get reasonably high marks. It's easy because I can hide behind our Constitution. Well, what does Professor Schwartz think? Doesn't matter. What did the court say? But there's times when that's not possible. One time, I'm the parent of a trans child who came out very, very recently, just in time to celebrate a massive assault on his humanity at the hands of his government, right? Who wants me to walk into my classroom and say, that's fine, that sounds like a public policy question we can all just grapple with together neutrally? Does anyone want that to be the price of this job? No. So, no. I mean, I hope. Or if you do, that's all good. But, you know, I have this weird tendency to not get fired, even though I do things like show the university's Form 990 to my students and be like, angry? Anyway, right. I don't know. It's been a good run. Anyway. Anyway, so that'll be, my question for you will actually be, what do you do when the news is about you, right? And one answer is just don't touch it, maybe. But sometimes you have to if you teach something like that. My framework, my thing that I'll say is my approach, though, and it's maybe a little too philosophical, but as with so many days, you wake up in the morning and Megyn Kelly has taught you something. Never, but okay. So Megyn Kelly has had a really bad day because she found out that unlike when she was a child, apparently in 1832, you're not allowed to wear blackface. Oh no. Halloween is over. I'm actually going as sexy George Will, but No, really, actually, my kid dared me. We have an interesting dynamic. And I love him, and I'm fighting for him. But anyway, so Megyn Kelly's very troubled by the sad society we're in, where you can't wear blackface anymore. Damn that Abraham Lincoln. And so she's in a very can I, and all the people who like her are like, yeah, this is really bad. This is really upsetting. She can't. You know, what have we come to? But the weird question that comes from that, and that is my philosophy of inclusive teaching and being, is, Megyn, I actually know the answer, but hypothetically, rhetorically, to everybody else, why wouldn't you want to see being kind as an opportunity? Like, what is it about getting to push the envelope of what people can stand appeals to you, right? I can't think of anything for me. That's my limit. That's my boundary. And I think that's a fair question to ask our students and colleagues to ask of themselves. Yes, I want you to feel comfortable sharing anything related to our learning objectives, but can you look inward to that question of what you want from yourself and ask yourself, do I want something from myself that makes me somebody that people want to work together with and learn with? And then go from there, even if it means a bunch of dumb questions and stumbling. That's what I do. Not saying I do it great, but that's what I do. I just go from the presumption that I have an opportunity to make it better. And like Rose, I ask a lot. I ask a lot what I'm doing wrong and what I can do better. I even spend the last class of every semester asking people how we can improve the course together in a group discussion. So that's one thing about being kind. You could ask someone whether blackface is a good costume. Maybe don't ask so much unpaid labor from certain segments of our population that have already put in 1 billion hours of unpaid labor, but maybe just ask and try. So I'll put up my question on the board is, what if the news is about you? And what we'd like to do is for the tables to take about 10 minutes and engage with, I think we were going to assign them, one of these 3 questions. What do you do when even purple can be a trigger? What do you do when everything could really hurt somebody? But even something affirming that helps a lot of people. What do you do about these comments? Wow, I was man-hating and I want it better. It was man-hating, or I didn't get to say my thing. And what if the thing that happened in the news that might even be in the wheelhouse of your course was specifically about you, at the core of who you are? What is your neutrality and inclusivity approach? So should we just do it by like rows of tables?
Yeah. Or let them just pick. Yeah.
Or just pick, yeah.
Yeah.
So pick for your table which one to engage with if you're just 2 people. So let's pull back together and figure out how our groups address the problems. And we don't have a hierarchy of problems. It's whoever's feeling like jumping in and saying, okay, this is how I would address whichever of the 3 you did.
So we have a microphone back here, so if you raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. Otherwise, Kim will just randomly walk around and hand the microphone.
Or anything you talked about that our examples or ideas might have sparked. You don't have to necessarily solve anything, but what it led you to discuss or to think about at your table. Oh, very good. And your name is?
Hi, I'm Jamie June. I'm an undergraduate advisor in SPA. So I do work in a student-facing role, but I'm not a faculty member. So we decided to discuss how to handle the student who feels like the class is man-hating. So we kind of talked about that. And so we talked about a few things. So the first thing that we covered was... Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, very close, really close.
Oh, okay, very close, great. So the first thing that we talked about was contextualizing and first realizing that a lot of the times when an identity is being discussed, students feel like that's an attack on them personally as the individual. So trying to first explain that you're providing context. And so we talked about the idea of setting ground rules at the beginning of a class for discussion, and first saying that the goal is not to attack students, and any comments made about an identity is not about that person, it's about providing context. So we talked about patriarchy, for example, and it's explaining, for example, the fabric of the society that we live in and why things are the way they are, and not making blanket statements about men, for example. So that's one thing that we talked about. We also talked about Rose's comment on the importance of storytelling and narrative. And so trying to humanize the unpopular opinion. So there was a book that was written, the name escapes me, but it was the freshman reading about Trump voters. What was it?
Oh, strangers in their own
Okay, everyone else knew it. Thank you. Strangers in their own land. And so finding a way to humanize the opposing opinion, even if it's the conservative or unpopular one in the room, since we talked about how the way that individuals think and the things that they do are a reflection of their life experiences. So there's reasons for that even if you don't agree with them, and hopefully coming to a place in the classroom where we're just seeking to understand why people feel the way they do and why they do the things they do, rather than seek to argue or to be right or wrong. And so hopefully that's a place where students can agree to disagree and at least understand maybe why someone based on their lived experiences would think a certain way that would lead them to act a certain way. Does that cover?
Is there a line?
A what?
Is there a line? Is there so two questions come to mind to throw back to you or anyone. Is there a line? Is Holocaust denial a line? Is the superiority or inferiority of one race, gender, group, orientation of other a line? And is that a check that I can write on someone else's account to say you need to seek to empathize with whatever this opinion might be?
Is that for me? Okay. Oh, I think they have it over there.
Great.
Thank you. Now, I'm sitting here listening as a social scientist, and I'm saying this is not opinion. This is not opinion. If someone comes in and says there was no Holocaust, there is data to show that human beings were killed based on systematic political decisions. It's not an opinion. And I think it's very important in our classes as professors that we distinguish the difference between an opinion and data. And I teach sociology, and I deal with this all the time. And I come in and I'm very straight and very upfront with them the first day of class. You all hold your own opinions, which is exactly why you're at a university. They should have their own opinions. But I believe our job as professors is to say and to rigorously question their opinions. So if there is no line, to me, this is the line is, in my life, science. Show me the data. I will say to you, if this is what you believe, if this is your opinion, you have to show to me and make a rigorous case as to why this is not appropriate. And I think that's very, very different than somebody having an emotional response to a traumatic event that is part of the conversation. I work with people who are traumatized. I have to acknowledge that in class, and that's one of the things to say. As humans, we evolved with this capacity to respond, and if some of you feel this is going to be difficult, let me know. I mean, I really think part of our job as professors is to be very clear that we have reflected on this, that we do have a few more years of experience, and that their opinion is extraordinarily valid, but it has to be defended.
Oh, you're
Right behind you.
Sorry. Well, to me, this brings up, I'm going to sit, as I said, is this loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay. To me, this brings up really one of the most essential questions. And my way of reconciling this, because I think what you said was beautifully said, is that despite the fact that certain things happened and certain things didn't happen, and there is some truth and some things that are not true, people nonetheless will believe what they want to believe for their own emotional reasons. And you often will not change their minds with facts. And to me, that's the lesson of modern times in recent years. And how you deal with that, You know, it's like we're living in very different realities, but the realities spring from your head. Years ago, I knew someone who used to always say to me, there is no such thing as reality, there are just many people's interpretations. And boy, I really understand the meaning of that now more than I ever did many years back. But I mean, I have no solution or don't know what to do about this, but I agree with you, facts are facts, and the Holocaust happened. But there are people that don't believe that, or don't believe a birth certificate when they see it, or don't believe all kinds of things, and I don't know, what do other people say about this? You can't make them change their mind. It is the beauty and the ugliness, in a way, of human beings, that in reality, we all are like that in different ways. We all, in whatever ways are issues for us, see things the way we want or need to, and irrespective of what's true, I think.
I'm just going to introduce a data point as well to draw on that. So there's an Atlantic article today or yesterday describing a Pew study regarding people's capacity to distinguish facts from opinions by age group. And the good news is the people the age of our students actually are the best at it, and the worst at it are actually people over 65. The bad news is that the age group we're teaching, actually it's 34% of them who accurately identify an opinion as an opinion, as opposed to as a fact. It goes down to a delightful 17% in the over 65. So, when you see Uncle Jed at Thanksgiving, act accordingly. But so this concept, right, that 34%, I don't know what it is among our AU students. I think it would be fantastic to try and find out. But this concept of slippage, it's not even necessarily just a matter of a belief that everything's an opinion, but as well, even possibly an incapacity to distinguish. We're teachers, so hopefully we're getting to that, but that's the hurdle.
But an awful lot of opinions are not data-driven or scientifically relatable at all. If the topic is, what is the role of government? It's not a data-driven answer, right? Which is the best religion? The data on that. But these are all big picture items. And how people view the world, how they view the role of government, drives them in an awful lot of what follows that. If you think the role of government is to really get involved and help people and do all that, then how your politics go, follow that. If you think the government is to do as little as possible and let people stand on their own, then that's going to drive an awful lot of your opinions about other stuff. So I think these bigger pictures are really what drives most people. So thank you.
Other comments, other things that people discussed at your tables?
Just tell the punchline.
Once upon a time, I'll just try to make an anecdote that happened in my classroom, very brief, which was that along the lines of how do conservatives or men or whites feel included in classes as well, or able to kind of be a part of that discussion as well. So there was a discussion in my class where more or less an African American female, in discussions about government and what governments should do, said that Republicans hate all blacks and poor people, and it was tricky in that moment to separate. And I guess what we talked about at our table a lot was kind of how do you separate the personal from the facts and the personal from the opinion. And so when I tried to push back a little bit and say, well, different political orientations have different views about how people should become wealthy and how people should have opportunity in life, etc., so that it wasn't quite such a blanket statement. Then she responded by saying, well, my grandparents grew up in a shack on a plantation, and they were tenant farmers, and so it was one of the struggles that we were I was having in that moment was how do you both honor someone's personal experience and their family experience while also trying to balance out the conversation a little bit so that it doesn't shut down other people's opportunities to share their personal experiences or their beliefs.
Right.
Anyone have I was going to ask for a solution.
No, and one other thing too we have to think about when we look at events, particularly in the study of international studies, and you look at events that happen, for instance, you take 9/11, yes, the event happened, and yes, a man walked on the moon, and yes, the Holocaust happened. But then there is this huge interpretive space where people then give meaning to the event. What did the event mean? What did it signify? You know, what did 9/11 mean? How do we define that event? What was it? And we're still arguing over that conversation of what it actually meant. So I think there's a space, and no one is denying that these events did not occur, but it shows you, what I try to illuminate for students is that interpretive space that we all inhabit of what things mean and what we take away from witnessing or participating or hearing or learning about that event. So I think that's also a space to discuss with students, the interpretive space of what that event means or signifies. So I think you can be true to the experience of the student, but then it sits in that broader interpretive context about inequality, about race, about gender, about class, and how we address those. And then I always do find in class, you know, I'm not equipped to answer every single thing that they're going to come up with or issue they're going to present. And they're going to come up with statements that I don't have immediately accessible data to do that. So I flip it around and I say to them, okay, what would we need to be able to come to some type of a well-informed position on this issue? What questions would we need to answer? Where might we need to look? So to problematize it for them and to say to them, take a look at this issue. What would we need to get close to be able to make some type of a determination on this particular statement that someone made?
Yeah, and I would say in one of my classes, every reading journal that they do a reading journal for every class, or for most of them. They're supposed to ask a question about the reading. You know, what do I still not know? What would I need to know? What do I still need to know to actually be more of an expert on whatever this topic is? So that idea of, okay, what would we need to know to verify that? What would we need to know to become more of an expert on that? And you can throw it to that student, because in the statement that your student made about, you know, her experience regarding what Republicans feel about African Americans, feel about poor people, you know, what they feel is just one of those unverifiable things, I think. There was a policy question there, though. You know, okay, what has happened? What policy coming out of that party or that movement has been particularly damaging to poor people or people of color? Can you draw me out? You know, and that's I think it's a variation on, okay, support it with facts, right? But I think the difference between, you know, a claim that's like climate change is caused by gay frogs, you know, hey, support it with facts, and really there aren't any. And let's move from your experience question, the policy space, the ecosystem you're living in, your grandparents lived in, to the what is the external verifiable, tangible thing in the world that has happened to them or you that comes from this party or comes from this political movement. And I think that's a question that moves the classroom as well toward, it's an anchoring in facts that doesn't attack that this is pointless ad hominem.
Can I just add one thing? I think those are really great ideas, and I'm going to add an idea from Patrick Jackson. It's not my own, but I love to repeat it, which is when there's a controversial claim, the idea is to put it up on the board, write it up on the board, and take it away from that student, which personalizes it. Say, okay, here's the claim. Why would someone think that? And put up all the sort of reasons, and you know, it could be because they listen to faulty sources, or they have alternative facts. I mean, whatever, you can look at it whichever way it goes. Yeah. It can be okay, and then it could lead into Rosa's suggestion of, you know, what more information will we need to add that. But what I like about it is it takes it away from the personal and puts it, and what are the assumptions behind this question, this claim?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I do, is put it on the board. Because you're right, it draws it right away, yeah. And that, well, in that way too, you can list out what it is you need, and the students can participate, and from any perspective on that spectrum.
But can I tie it back into some of the stuff Maya was talking about, which is I really need to do more of, which is to validate the student's story. I find myself, I'm really just so bound to the text and not seeing their personal experiences as also as text. And so, especially with this generation, I think we need to see their stories as text, and then take that and say, okay, so what would the Thompson reading say to that? You know, and draw, hopefully, because that personal experience is related to something in the reading, which is always my fantasy. All right.
I'll be brief, but to me, I mean, these are all good points, and they're ways of saying, delineating the spectrum of ways of thinking, which I think is very helpful for a teacher or just in any conversation with friends. Doing what a lawyer does, which is, this is our case, you have to anticipate what the other lawyer's case is, and why did they think that way, and what, so that you really, I think as a teacher or anyone trying to guide a conversation, you can say, well, people think this way, and then some people think this way, and that way you provide a framework and you humanize the different points of view. And these are all ways of saying that, I think, of outlining the spectrum.
Well, and I think, though, not necessarily always, right? Because there are going to be a so-called point of view that cross a line, you know? I've had students say, they're Trump voters, and I just stop. And I say, we just don't do that in here. It's easy in part because it's irrelevant. You know, what you think as we're having a conversation about some free speech case about Trump voters, you know, worth nothing, right? It offered nothing into our classroom. Someone the other day, I was talking about this case called Hobby Lobby. It's about a company that doesn't want to provide contraception under Obamacare, right? And I was like, the Greens who owned the company, they were evangelical Christians, and someone did this like a really, really disrespectful thing. And I just had to turn and say, there isn't any room for religious bigotry in this classroom, and just move right on. There is a line. I don't have to humanize anti-religious bigotry. I hope most people won't. And it's just a tough judgment call. But I think this idea of drawing the thing that's within the realm of academic, the realm of professionalism, the kind of thing you'd say in any job, which is, I think, roughly the standards for a classroom. Taking it, removing it from the person, separating the people from the problem, as we say in mediation, right, and negotiation theory, separate the people from the problem. I have a ground rule, we talked about ground rules in advance. I have a ground rule that I don't want to hear any statements regarding other people ever. So Republicans are this, Aiden always says that. I don't want to hear a statement about other people. There's not a chance. Necessarily, unless you're saying, 84% of Republicans support the building a wall. I made up that stat, sure. But just a statement about someone else's character, or certainly what's in their minds, unsupported by a poll, it's just a ground rule we don't in my class. Everybody's gonna come up with a different line. I guess you can say, well, why did Sparky dislike evangelical Christians so much? Should we pause and reflect? It's not what I would do. Someone could.
Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So my name is Sarah Jones. I'm an AUX instructor. And one of the things that I think is really important about creating a dialogue in my classroom is making sure the students understand intent versus impact. So I think that a lot of students will say things, or we might set a ground rule where it's like, hey, we're not making generalized statements, stuff like that, but students get involved in these discussions and they might have opinions that might come up. But what's important is that as instructors, we take a second and we make it a teaching moment, a learning moment for them. And we say, hey, like what you said, you might have had good intentions there, but you don't know how that impacted Sparky over in the corner, for example. So making sure that all our students are aware that, opinions happen, opinions are said in the classroom, but you need to make sure that you're taking a pause out and understanding how that what you're saying might affect someone else in the classroom.
Hi, Regina Kern. I'm the Title IX Program Officer for the university. And I just sort of wanted to go off of that and maybe tie it in with a couple of other things that we're saying. I really appreciate that a lot of this conversation is focused on student learning. And in particular, when you're talking about impact and we're thinking about triggers, I get asked questions quite a bit about trigger warnings, content warnings, is that necessary, And I think sometimes the presumption is, are you going to tell me what to teach in my class? The answer is no, because I don't have a PhD in any subject. I have JD, I can maybe talk about that. But I think if we think about this idea of what is our intent, what are the learning objectives, right? And they are X, Y, and Z. We want students to walk out, having hopefully mastered or certainly at least gained more knowledge in these particular areas. I think it sort of goes back to this idea of a trigger warning, which is that if we want them to learn this thing, sometimes we have to equip them with the ability to learn that thing. And that might be just a, hey, heads up, when you're reading this particular assignment on page 78, there's a very graphic description of rape. It's the assignment, but that would allow you potentially, if you needed to prepare for the impact of that, to prepare to address it in a way that you can, to put yourself in a position to read it, maybe not in the middle of the library when you're gonna have a reaction to it or what have you. So I do just want to sort of say that I have appreciated the arc of this particular conversation in really focusing on student learning and the impact of various pedagogical methods, but also just simple things like potentially a trigger warning or content warning on their ability to gain information, and hope that going forward, anyone who interacts with my office would hear that same sort of thing espoused, right?
So these are the kinds of conversations that we could probably have many, many hours together, and I'm actually hoping to have more of them. On the 7th, the day after the election, we are going to do an informal coffee or just chat in CTRL space about how to, whether to, talk about the elections. I don't know if anyone follows current events, there are some elections soon. But I think each of us as well, before we head out, is just going to give sort of a punchline of food for thought.
Oh, wow. I think something that we don't realize is just how many students do have some trauma in their history, right? And how many students are coming to college already having trauma. So just keeping that in mind. And we are a resource that you can refer your students to, but we can also, chat with you too if you're wanting to make things better for your classroom environment.
I would really just encourage you as you're establishing your class to really think about the environment of the class and how you create this context where it is a space of mutual vulnerability, where professors will reveal certain things about themselves. Laura, indicating with her child. And I think all of us reveal pieces of ourselves in the classroom. And I think it's important that we do that. We're honest, we're open with students, and that we model that so that they feel comfortable doing that in that classroom as well. I will end with one really nice thing that a student said in my evaluation. She also manages to do all of this while maintaining a class environment where we can have a few laughs in between discussing serious things. And if anything describes my mode of teaching, I'm writing a teaching article currently, and it's called, I Love Teaching, It's Fun. And that's, I think, at the end of the day, it's a journey that's shared, it is fun, and you want to have laughs in between a lot of really serious, negative, challenging things you're grappling with in the classroom. But if you can find and make the spaces to laugh, to enjoy why you're all working on this and why you're sharing this journey, I think that goes a long way to creating that space where you can have really deep and rich, I think, disagreement, but also really rich conversations. So that's what I would end with. Thank you.
And mine is, I think, follows to that. I really believe every class should become a learning community. I realize we talk about AU as a learning community. I actually think each class should be. I find that people don't consider self-regulation as a burden. They consider it as a positive if you find ways to have them mutually invested in each other's success. I do group projects. I have fail-safe ways of making sure everybody works in them. They rate each other as colleagues as part of the grade. But I think I assign people as partners and give them a grade on actually how helpful they were to each other. I find that people who have to help each other as part of the course, and I tell them, in your job someday you'll have to do this, even if you're a cello soloist, you're still going to have to work with some orchestra behind you, right? There's no job. You're not going to do that, right? I find that if they're mutually invested in one another's well-being, the will and desire toward kindness overcomes, obnoxiousness, overcomes resenting that you can't wear blackface or something. My happy place, it's not a teaching eval, although some of them come out okay, is I've got moot court for my constitutional law course tonight on my undergrad con law class. And last night I posted I have a big 300-person Facebook group of people who have taken my classes or are, and I posted anybody from old constitutionistas have advice for new constitutionistas for moot court, and the advice poured in all night from students who are no longer in the class, no longer have a grade to get, saying, hey, do this, try that, I tried this. A few people were even vulnerable and said, on a big group with hundreds of people, and you can just share it, it's public, this is what I got wrong, They were just helping each other because they were used to it already, and it just did my heart good. I do think some of our students can be clods, but I think they would like the opportunity, like me, but they would like the opportunity to be good to each other, which is actually what all of this is about.